Good afternoon. We will get started in about 30 seconds once we let everybody into the room. Good afternoon and welcome to Gray Associates Masterclass on Academic Program Evaluation. Today's class is class 3 and we're talking about predictive analytics. Few housekeeping things to start with. At the very bottom of your screen, you will see a question Q&A section. If you have any questions, please put them in there. It allows other people to upvote them to make sure we answer the most relevant ones. Our two hosts will be taking questions as we go and answer them in the order they receive them and as long as time permits. If you have any technical difficulties or you just want to comment, please feel free to drop that into the chat. Today's hosts, I'm really excited to introduce, are Zach Paz and Pete Starrett. They are both partners here at Gray Associates, as well as our chief product officers. They are responsible for a lot of the software you will be seeing today, as well as some of the software we've talked about on previous classes. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Zach.
Awesome. Thank you, Ned. And welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about predictive analytics and some applications of that, specifically within higher ed. There's kind of 3 areas that we're going to be talking about today, but again, there's many applications for this. But the 3 areas that we'll be focusing on are budgeting and planning, where we'll look at planning your program portfolio, understanding where your programs are going, what programs are in growth markets, decline markets, and other. We'll look at predicting your margins, understanding that shifts in enrollment will affect margins of your programs. And then we'll also look at value proposition and pricing, where we'll understand and predict demand shifts depending on changes to your value proposition and price of your programs. Underneath operations and marketing, we'll look at using predictive analytics to look at optimizing locations, whether that's relocating or adding satellites or new campuses, and also leveraging similar methodology to look at focusing your marketing and recruiting efforts geographically to be to be more efficient. And then finally, we'll look at one area under academics, looking at understanding the skills trends, trying to understand what's going to be needed in the future, and then how do you match that up against what you're offering to identify any gaps and potential opportunities for you to close those gaps between your curriculum and what's needed in the workforce. So without further ado, we'll jump right into our first topic, which is program portfolio planning. We often get questions around how do we think about what programs are going to be growing, what programs are going to be shrinking, and how do you plan as an institution plan for that, whether that's understanding what resources you need, maybe you need additional sections or courses, also understanding what are, or even facilities that you might need depending on what programs are in growth areas. So one area that you can really focus on is looking at market trends to understand which of your programs are growing or in declining markets. Some factors that you want to consider when you're thinking about your program portfolio growth projections are looking at population changes, even demographic changes. How is that shifting within your local market or region or even nationally? Looking at programs that understanding that you're most likely going to be teaching out programs that maybe reach the end of their life cycle. So how does that affect how will that affect your enrollment? Understanding that you're going to be looking at new programs as well. So what are the ideas around projecting those new programs? And we'll actually talk a little bit more about that in our next masterclass around predicting enrollment. But again, should be considered as a factor when you're thinking about your whole portfolio. And then the question is, with your current program portfolio, which programs are in declining markets? And you need to understand that you either need to monitor those and understand that to make sure that you're not losing enrollment. In declining markets, it's really about maintaining share or even growing share so that you're not declining enrollment at your institution. And then the nice one is the growing markets. So what programs are in growing markets? How do you realize that growth is another piece of this that you kind of take in the next steps. But combining all that can help you estimate what your enrollment will be in the future, considering all of those factors. So how do you actually even get to this? There's some data sources that are available to help you do this. The most common is looking at the US Census data to understand population trends within your markets, understanding the demographics in your markets and how those are shifting, looking at the programs in your markets and at other institutions, understanding the trends in enrollment and graduations. And then also looking specifically at the program demographics can help you get into some other areas around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we kind of put all of that together so that you can get an idea of looking forward in terms of what your enrollment will be going forward for each program, and what does that look like in terms of the shifts in your gender and ethnicity makeup. And so that's one of the pieces that I know is becoming increasingly important, is this whole the idea around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so some of the data will help you identify what are the shifts based on the programs that you offer, and what happens when you add new programs, what kind of what are the demographics of those programs. And it can help you kind of meet your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, or at least inform those to understand changes in your program portfolio and how that will affect the demographics of your student population, and then ultimately plan resources around those shifts, and even including student services. So again, using market data to help forecast your enrollment by program, looking at both growing markets, declining markets, changes in your program portfolio, whether those are you're teaching out programs or adding new programs, and then aligning that with the demographic information can really give you a good information around planning for your program portfolio. All right. Now let's jump into, I'll pass over to Pete to talk to you about predicting margins.
Thanks, Zach. So this really plays into some of what Zach was just sharing, where one of the logical next steps is to take that information relating to program sizes and where they're heading, and use that to run scenarios to see what those changes will mean to ultimately the program margins. So this really next tool, or tools plural, that you could put together takes that information and creates a model that allows you to predict what program margin looks like. And the way to do that is really, first you need to have built a historical model, which I know on the last masterclass Steve touched on a little bit how to do that if you aren't today. But really this means you need to know the economics for not only your programs, but also the courses and sections within those courses, in terms of really how many students are in them, what those students are paying, and what it costs to teach each individual section. And you need that for all the prior years and semesters that you can include that for, which then you need to be able to pull that from existing systems to produce reports, which gets you to historically your what is analysis. What have our revenue, costs, and margins look like for all those different dimensions? And then really the next step is to take all of that data and produce a predictive report, or a what if analysis, where different scenarios can be tested, like what happens if we hit the numbers that come from that planning model Zach shared, or even what happens if we hit our own internal targets that may have been put together in our budgets or plans based on numbers of inquiries, or targets we want to hit based on current enrollment numbers we're at in the most recent full year. So that's kind of the structure of how it needs to be built. And then how you do that is really on the next slide here, the difficult task where, and I'm sure any of you finance folks out there have, potentially done this process in the past, but really this image here kind of lays out the basics of how to do it. Though this, illustrates it in a simple Excel table, but really just due to the sheer number of programs and courses an institution may have, it's not really possible to do in Excel. It just take too long and probably eventually crash. Because if we take the matrix at the center of the page here, that large table as our starting point, the columns across the top are programs. And here we have 12, but again, institutions can easily have more than 100 programs. And then down the left here in the rows, we have our courses, which again, could be in the thousands, depending on however many courses you have. So that's where, again, even the starting point to put that into Excel can be a difficult task, because we haven't even started on the calculations yet, and we could have, hundreds by thousands of rows and columns here. And then, again, kind of going through the process here, though, the values in the cells represent your enrollments. So let's take the first row here where we've got course 1, which is AC 101. It's got 1 student in program 6, 2 students in program 10, and 24 students in program 11, for a total of 27 students, which I know is probably difficult to read due to the size of the fonts here. But then also what you don't see on the page is we'd have a total for the programs at the bottom as well, which, would fall beneath all the course listings. And really, this is kind of the foundation of where all the calculations begin. This is, again, looking at the historical model of what courses are students taking in each of the programs that they're currently enrolled in. And so then at the top of the sheet here, we've got shown, an illustrative for the 12 programs. We've got changes being made to each of those programs where we're adding students to several of them. And we've got a pretty large decline in program 4 here of about 30 students, you see. And so if we take program 4 as an example, the way the model works is it will now go through all of the courses that those students in program 4 are in, and essentially remove students from those courses, remove those 30 students across all of the courses they were in, based on, again, a proportional allocation algorithm that goes through every individual course, calculates what percentage of those students are in each course, and therefore allows us to calculate, or would allow you all to calculate, how we can essentially remove students from that. And the other really important thing is you'd also need an algorithm built in there that then makes sure that all of these changes are converted to integers and still total the total new program enrollment. Right? We don't want to, take these calculations for, their exact numbers and say we end up with, a half a student in a course. So that's, what you want to avoid, and why you need to convert to integers, but make sure you still end up at that same total. And that's really just the start of this whole process, where it's then, getting into how does this affect the number of sections we need to offer? Because the goal of all this is to ultimately determine how our margins are going to change. So while here we may be able to see in the third course here, that third row, AN 111, we'll probably lose a majority of students in that course because there were 32 students in program 4 enrolled in there. What we then need to figure out is how many sections were there? Let's say there were 2. Now we need to use metrics like our ideal and maximum class sizes, or section sizes really, to determine, after we made that cut, can we, are we able to fit this remaining students into one section? And therefore, are we then below that maximum possible class size for an AN 111 course, which would ultimately mean we're able to, or could potentially, I should say, cut one section, which means we're cutting an adjunct or, part of a full-time load, depending on how it all adds up in the end. So we're able to see what the cost saving is for that particular course all the way up through that particular program. And really the other side of this is also, we're growing many programs. So if we're to add students to several of these programs, we're going to then increase the number of students in sections that, again, those students are typically enrolled in. And that's where, again, you have these ideal and maximums built in as step functions, so that eventually as these classes fill, you need to figure out where we may potentially need to add additional sections. And that's what this model does to allow you to see, as we grow, if I, pick on biology as one of the programs, we're going to increase the number of students. We're therefore potentially going to need it to increase, some biology courses, which may mean adding biology sections and potentially biology faculty and so on. And this really affects the economics of all programs, because again, you're going to have other students outside of biology also in those programs. So there's a lot of trickiness that goes on to, putting a model like this together to be able to predict how these program changes affect your margins. So with that, if we jump to the next slide, this just gives you a sense of how this all comes together, where you can see, again, ultimately how changes in enrollment will affect the margins, right? So here, if we add 10 students to our mathematics program, which, again, is a pretty small program, but here we're able to see how does, growing a small program actually affect our financials in terms of, will we need to add sections, which we can see here, we've got to add a few sections, or four sections anyways, where we've increased our revenue, but also we've increased costs because we had to add some sections. So again, this is where all of this can be shown, even for a very small program, to see how that affects everything. But then alternatively, jumping to the next slide, another important piece of, or interesting thing to look at is what happens if we now cut a small program, and, what do we save in terms of revenue as well as costs? And this is another important scenario to play out where, cutting, in this case, music had 13 students in it. We cut music, we lost over $117,000 in revenue, but we only saved $15,000 in cost. So again, this gives you the ability to see, does cutting a small program actually help? In this case, it would insinuate that it doesn't, but you'd have the details to go through that, maybe there are some courses that aren't showing up here because, we may have other students taking music courses but aren't in a music program. So we're not saving truly the full cost of, the music department. Sorry if there are any music faculty out there. We're not planning on cutting music, but again, this gives you the ability to really drill down to see how these decisions impact our overall institution's financials. And before we do jump to the next section, we did have one question come in that asked, how are you taking into consideration the drop in intake with different semesters? The drop may not impact for several years even. And that's true. And really what we're, I should say the way we view building this model is really you're looking at next year's numbers. So you're building this model where you're looking at however many students there were in the most recent year and making changes to the number of new students coming into that program. So that's sort of how we view it, where you'll still have those other students enrolled in the program. So if we had a base of students that are now going to become sophomores, juniors, and seniors, the way we view this is that those students still exist. We're really just decreasing the number of new students and ultimately decreasing the overall size of the program and seeing how that change affects the financials in the end. So that was predicting margins. The next will, now start to switch into some other topics that are not, quite program specific, though they can be. And certainly don't, when we talk about value proposition and pricing, really the whole predictive piece comes sort of towards the end of all of the work you need to put into to get to that result. And really the point of all this is really to see how changes to your value proposition, which pricing is certainly a part of that, will affect really the demand for your, an individual program potentially, but ultimately the institution as a whole, and how you can use some of these levers to increase enrollment in, future years based on these changes. And so really how you do this starts, if you want to flip slides here, Zach, is first off taking into account all of the potential ideas that could go into your value proposition. There's obviously some basics I mentioned, like price would be in there. So what is tuition? What are our fees? What are we offering for scholarships? But there are other, qualitative values as well, such as modality, or just flexibility as a whole for the program. There could be things you include about, individual spaces that schools have to offer. So there's just a whole other level of ideas that can go into how you essentially share this information in what ultimately would be done through surveys. That could include outcomes as well, right? How do our graduation rates compare to our competitors, or our employment rates or employer relationships, and so on. So really the first step of the whole process is, defining a short list of those, again, important attributes that are salient to respondents as well as we go through this process. And that's where you can go through several different iterations of survey work, as well as statistical analyses, to determine, first starting with that long list, to then screening that long list using a max diff and turf analysis, to deciding on what that short list is, to then running a discrete choice survey to determine, how pulling each of these different levers will affect demand. And how this all works is, and some of this will be, I'm sure, very similar to a lot of folks out there who I'm sure have gone through these processes. But on the next slide is just, an example of what this looks like as you go through these processes, where, again, the point of the max diff is to take all those ideas that, might come from internal focus groups as well as focus groups with students, where, you're determining what are the, some of the features students are using to make decisions about which school to attend. And so the max diff provides, where you can run a survey with current students, with prospects, with outside panels, that again can be segmented so that it's not just one overall outcome for the institution, where you can do this by program areas. Getting down to individual programs can be tough when you're, again, considering different sample sizes associated with an individual program, and getting to the numbers you need for some of these analyses is sometimes difficult when you get down to too specific a segment. But again, you can do it in particular by at least college or department or program area, whatever you choose. And then within that, you can segment different student types as well. Whether, on the chart off to the right here, we've got it split between traditional and adult learners. So again, thinking through how you want to segment to be able to use this data is very important. And really the process is just, provide them with all these different features and ask respondents to pick the one that's most appealing and the one that's least appealing. So that, again, you run this through a statistical model to create something like you see off to the right, where we have an index of, based on respondents' answers, what truly was most important to those respondents when they were going through this process. And really, I should say most appealing is what we're obviously focusing on in this particular example you see on the screen here. And so then the next step is to go through, and after you've determined each of those different features, you need to then assign values to those. And that's really important, because you want to choose, or really I should say set, for tuition, for example, you want to set ranges that you can and would actually meet. we want to present, again, as we release this information or this survey, present respondents with numbers that, we would be willing to decrease, our tuition to this amount, or, essentially wherever we can increase it or decrease it to, whether that's 10% or 20%, or whatever it might be for you all. And then basically we would have different levels so that students are comparing one institution to another, where you may see 55,000 in one screen for institution A, and then you might see 60,000 compared to 67,000 now for institution B. So again, the point is that these change, and what we're seeing is we're seeing how respondents, again, choose their institution based on how each of these different attributes or features change throughout the screens. And again, the whole point of this is to then take that information from all the respondents to, again, run that through a statistical model to determine how, again, if we're institution A, how does our demand change if we were to move from a $2,000 scholarship to a $5,000 scholarship? On the chart to the right, this is an example of how demand does change, where we can see actually, our baseline scenario is that we're offering a $0 scholarship. If we increase our scholarship to $5,000, we see, and again, this is illustrative, but a 66% increase in demand. And so this allows you to take that information from the survey and build this model out to see what the sensitivity is to each individual attribute that we tested in all of the different levels that we tested for those attributes. So that in the end, we end up with, on the next screen, again, as we call it, a decision support system, where you can play around with all of these different attributes and levels, not just, for our institution, but for the competitors we tested against, to see what happens if we were to, for example, run an everyday low price scenario, where we decrease our tuition to the lowest level and we might increase our scholarship to the highest level. And so we can see what that means in terms of a change in starts, where, we go from a baseline of 3.2 up to 3.5 here. However, when we then apply that to the decrease in essentially net tuition per student, we actually lose money in terms of our overall margins, because and this is actually a really important piece of this, is calculating what the financials look like, not just what the demand changes look like. And this is how you really build this into the model of, and how this applies to what we looked at with the margins as well, is you'd want to include some cost information in here as well, especially any step functions you may have in terms of what the costs are, in particular variable cost per student, because a lot of times what folks will potentially miss is, that demand, obviously that increase looks great, and we can calculate what the change in revenue is. That's, not too difficult. We're just taking those new net tuition numbers. But we've also got a much higher cost now, potentially, if we've added, 20% more students, where, again, if we think back to those section sizes and how they may need to increase, we may need to add more faculty. So that's another important piece of this, where we need to factor that into the margin. And then another, again, thinking about these predictions and running through different scenarios, you'd also want to see what happens if our competitors match our pricing changes. It's obvious that we'll increase demands if we decrease tuition, but now what happens, and some of these would be obvious, if all of our competitors do the same. Now, again, we're all at this lower price, and demand may not have changed a whole lot. So again, building these models to run these different scenarios is extremely helpful and important to understanding what truly are the best offers. And, playing with the tuition here isn't always the best option for determining, or I should say, for changing your offer, right? Looking at these other attributes like modality, like, what happens if we do spend more time on or put more resources on our retention so that our graduation rates increase. Those are all just as important metrics to include in this. So that takes us through our value prop and pricing. One other, and before I pass to Zach, this other topic I do want to touch on, I won't spend a lot of time here, but also plays into this whole value prop aspect is the scholarship optimization. And there's certainly models out there and models you can build yourselves to help optimize what it is we're offering students, or I should say prospects, when they apply to our institutions. And again, this plays into the whole value proposition and pricing work, in that ultimately we're figuring out what are some of the scholarship amounts that we should advertise is really that first step. We could offer as much as a $10,000 or a $5,000 scholarship, maybe what you use to, again, increase that demand base. But then, you can get into these other models of once they're in the door, they've applied to the institution, using metrics that, again, you're able to capture on each individual student, or I should say prospect, to help put together a model that will optimize what we should offer these students. And if you jump to the next slide, Zach, I mean, again, this is where you can really start to get into, and I know we'll touch on some models when we get to the next subject in our masterclass as well. I should say touch on machine learning and AI. But this is an example of where you can apply some machine learning models to, again, all data that you have internally already by student to help put these models together. So this is where, again, you take, based on students who have attended your institution already in the past, what all of the different demographic variables are associated with those, and what we've essentially charged those students, to essentially train a model to help understand in the end what a person's likelihood is of enrolling based on the different offers that they're provided with. I will say that these models can be helpful in terms of if you've got a base of scholarship spend that you have access to or have the ability to use, of figuring out essentially where the best places to use that to, again, attract the most students. But again, it is important to understand that once this student's in the door, which is ultimately the goal of this model, is to attract the most students, it's then important to focus on the retaining that student in the end, because that's obviously we're mission based, and we obviously want to see our outcomes, or we want student outcomes to be successful. And a lot of times these models are put in place to attract the student, but then if we are offering a large scholarship, because that's what it required to get that student in the door, now they're paying less money, and it may associate, again, a smaller dollar amount with completing and therefore staying in the program. So it's important to really focus on, again, we're not going to get into all the retention models that again could be built off of this, but it's really important to have similar amounts of resources and potentially models built on the other end of the spectrum, in terms of once they're in the door, what do we have to pay attention to make sure they're getting through their courses, and we didn't just create this scholarship optimization to get them in the door and then ignore them, which I know is never the case, but certainly something I didn't want to ignore when discussing this topic.
All right, thanks, Pete. The next topic I want to touch on is location and marketing optimization. And there's two big questions that use similar methodologies, and that's why I kind of combine them into one. The first one is location selection, and this is very important, especially when you consider the decision that you're making typically when you're deciding on a new location, whether that's a new campus or a satellite campus, or you need to relocate. Those are typically very resource intense decisions as well as long-term commitments. So what data can you use to help inform the decision that you have to make? And really considering not just the new location, but how does that play with your current footprint in mind? A few things you need to take into account is how will this new location potentially cannibalize your other sites or even your main campus, and then also drive time and distance are often one of the biggest factors to keep in mind when thinking about location. So how could you go about doing this? And there's many different methodologies you can go about. One that we've seen success in the market is using machine learning models, where you have a series of inputs from US Census data by geolocation. You understand where your other institutions are offering the program, whether those are competitors, or even sometimes you might even understand that you have feeders into your programs. So competitor locations, but also potentially feeder for enrollment. And then looking at student demand indicators like Google search and enrollment data. That's on the market side, and that helps you build the model. And what you need to actually develop this is looking at your data. So understand where your students are coming from, whether that's, you have multiple campuses currently or multiple satellites. That really helps you identify the distance that they're traveling. And those are the inputs. What you're really trying to predict is, if I put a location in a new market, how many students am I expecting to attract based on my current student population and its proximity to those types of students. So you run that through a model, and the output is really useful to identify not only where the optimal location is, but what are the trade-offs that you might be making. One could be, the first thing to consider is that, yes, you might find an optimal location, but you actually don't have a site that's available there. So, having run scenarios so that you can say, okay, if I put a campus in every single potential location, what would the outcome be? That really allows you to then visualize, and that's what we're kind of illustrating on this map on the right. You would say, where can I put a location where I'm not too far from the optimal location? I can add things to a map like this, like competitor locations, convenience scores in terms of understanding, what it's like for a student to travel around the campus of the site. What's the crime index? So you can take that into account. So again, being able to run scenarios to say, if I put a location here versus here, and another option might be you have multiple sites, and what's the trade-off between one site versus the other, as well as, again, considering all of the factors from convenience, crime, and even cannibalization of your other locations. So again, very informative, especially when you're making a very resource-intensive long-term commitment. There's a lot of data that's available. Even descriptive maps can help, not even going all the way through to the machine learning, modeling. Descriptive maps can help you really hone in on an optimal location. Similar to the methodology for identifying optimal locations is, how do you focus your marketing geographically, and how can you optimize that? So you can use similar data in terms of demographics and student interest and competition by a geographic definition. Oftentimes we do this down to either the census tract, zip code, or even county level, so that we can really identify those demographics and trends within those specific geographies. And then you add a layer on top of this, which is marketing spend. And so understanding what is your historical results for how much you spend by market, what are the demographics for those markets, and what are your results, again, for that spend. And the goal is to help you utilize your resources in marketing and recruiting more efficiently. So first is evaluating a lead opportunity, and then second, what does it actually cost to produce leads in those markets? You can then also identify what are the different thresholds for meeting certain, cost per start or cost per lead in terms of your marketing metrics. And then finally, you can use these models to simulate spend. So again, I'll show you on this chart. One thing that we've done in the past is actually look at, okay, in each market, and maybe you have a list of markets, what if you spent $1,000? And then what is your outcome of that? How many leads would you produce? And then what's your cost per lead? Okay, in that same market, let's simulate spending $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000. And what you might find is different markets have different thresholds for breaking through. Again, you're competing with other institutions in the market for those leads. And there might be different thresholds for each market. And so using modeling techniques like this can help you understand what are the thresholds for the market and how do you reduce or be more efficient with your marketing dollars. So again, it can be using demographic modeling can help you again in location, identifying potential new sites, regional sites, satellite sites, new campuses, take into consideration distance, travel time, convenient and crime scores, as well as one of the most important pieces is cannibalization. You might identify a very good location, but it might be too close and you might actually cannibalize students and have a net negative outcome in terms of revenue. So always keep that in mind. And then the second piece is using similar techniques, adding on the spend portion of it to really understand in each market, how do you optimize your marketing spend and even your recruiting to be more efficient with your dollars. Understand what the thresholds are for actually breaking through in terms of lead generation in each market, and just being more informed around your geographic marketing spend. And then the final topic for today's masterclass is looking at skills trends and then taking that a step further, which is understanding the potential gap between what your curriculum is and what the employment market is looking for. So when we think about this, we're really using advanced analytics to understand what are the needs in the workforce and what are they going to be, and then how does that align with what you're teaching? What skills are potentially missing within your curriculum, and then potentially does that lead to new program opportunities for your institution? So when we start with the first portion of this, which is the skills trends, there's a lot of data out there to help you do this. Some of the data that we use is listed here, especially for understanding very future looking trends. We go to different publications, whether that's and funding sources like DARPA and NASA and where venture capital is going. But then we also look at just very current trends on what the employment market is needing. So very current information from job boards like Indeed or even LinkedIn can give you insight into what are the more requested skills, and that can help you kind of project down the future of what's going to be needed in the workforce. So again, understanding the very current needs from the employers in the market is going to be helpful when you're kind of projecting out what curriculum you're going to need for your programs. And then you kind of bring those all together to what we call our what we call a skills gap analysis. So you look at your programs, you look at your courses, and you do an inventory of what you're teaching, and try to identify where, ideally you would have a full inventory of the skills that are being taught in your courses, and then you align that up with what employers are looking for, and where you find a mismatch, or where you're not offering a program, or you're not offering courses, or you need to update your curriculum, is the gap that you might see between what employers are looking for and what you're offering. And so there's a lot of different techniques that you can use here. One thing that we're using is natural language processing to really understand, be able to read the course descriptions and the program descriptions to then quantify what skills are being taught at your institution, and then aligning that with the counts of those skills from the employment market. A very important piece of this is you need to have a skills taxonomy, and there's a lot of sources for that as well. One of them comes from the government, and it's the ONET taxonomy. And so there's others available out there. And so being able to inventorize your curriculum into that skills taxonomy and then also identify that within the employment market can really help you inform this gap and identify areas where you want to update your curriculum or add new programs to meet that gap. Right. So that concludes the topics for today's masterclass, and I think let me pass it back to Pete to talk about what's next.
Yeah, before we answer, some questions had come in throughout today's webinar, so we'll come back to those. But just quickly, before we do, some other resources we have on the topic surrounding program evaluation. Again, not covering quite all the same topics, but we do offer a certification course through BayPath on academic program evaluation and management. And our CEO, Bob Atkins, has a book on academic program evaluation and management that is coming out late May, I'm told. But Ned, who's on here, can provide you with some more info on how to pre-order that, which I think is available now, Ned, or coming soon.
If anybody wants more information, please go to robertgrayatkins.com. We have a mailing list and a newsletter for updates on that. We should have a pre-order available at the end of May, and the hard copies hopefully are in Bob's hands and ready for distribution in July.
So there you have it. And lastly, we have our fourth and final webinar on our masterclass, or in our masterclass series, occurring May 5th, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, where Bob will be hosting and discussing the future of academic program evaluation and management. So that'll include a look at the roles of AI, machine learning, and other new technologies in program evaluation and planning, which certainly has some overlap with what we discussed today, but he'll be covering some of the other topics as well as some things in the pipeline. So let's just again go back to some of the questions that came up throughout some of the sections we covered today. So so this must have been during the predict margins. We have a question: are you taking into account weighted student credit hours for lab courses? And if not, how do you do that? I mean, the short answer is yes. Really, the entire model is built on what students are currently taking and have taken in the past. So it's all really built on whatever or however your courses are structured. So if you're adding biology students, and biology students are typically in a lecture and a lab, it's, the model will be basically built to add students to the lecture and the lab, and will assign the right number of credit hours that each of those are worth. So the answer is yes. And then again, how that's done is really, it all depends on how your particular institution tracks the different types of course, or the different types of courses, really, right? Independent studies, another really unique one where, they're typically, you may not assign quite the same cost to that. But again, you have to account for the fact if we're growing, at a substantial rate, by definition, the number of students or faculty are managing are going to increase. So, again, independent studies therefore might increase. So while it's not, quite the same load as a full course, it is, the point of the model is to take all those different types into account. And then another question, or I guess a point that I'll mention, which I actually do think is interesting, but someone mentioned in Canada, we have seen increased demand with increased prices for graduate programs. So that is certainly interesting.
Actually, we have noticed, depending on the type of graduate program, that the price sensitivity is very low, and so the focus is then more on, at least we've seen in some results for some programs, is more on the accreditation and other value propositions. So, and that's why it's really important to go to the market and say, what are the decision points for you, and what's most important when you're deciding on program A versus program B. So it's not surprising that you've seen at the graduate level, less price sensitivity, as we've absolutely seen that with some results with some clients.
Mm-hmm. But certainly would come out of this work too, where I mean, again, having the ability to see how students respond. I mean, there are a number of behaviors that could explain that, but it's hard to say which one. But again, that's part of the research.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I think that, so again, if you do have any questions you just thought of one now, you should be able to enter those into the chat, and we'll answer them now for those of you who have stuck around still. And again, thank you all, for those of you still out there, for joining us today. And the resources for this will be available, I think, for all those who registered, and that's the recording as well as the presentation itself, which also exists for our past 2 master classes at this point.
Just to really quickly, we have one question about the elaborate in the masterclass. This masterclass, just so everybody knows, is free. It's offered by us, but I did put a link into the question. I'll also add it into the chat, where you can get a certificate program course offered by BayPath, which we also have contributed to. So I will add that to the chat as well.
Yeah, and I see one question I missed on how to measure enrollment behavior based on different scholarship offers. I mean, that's all, again, that's where it's ultimately built into whatever machine learning model you go with, where so the behaviors are all really and again, our recommendation is using a classification model, so not a regression model where you're coming up with an exact dollar amount, but and the point is, it's looking again at historical data, and obviously will continue to get better as you present these offers to students, and increase basically the number of rows that are then training this model to determine whether or not students do or do not attend the institution. So really, it's all built on historical results of what are the again, whatever factors you can track relating to the student, but what are those demographic, or it could be again related to their specific student demographics, but also grades they received in prior schooling, what their need is in terms of their financial aid. That all goes into the model, and then again, it's looking at students that have already come to your institution to build that. And so I mean, really, the behaviors are built in already. It's just you're using, that's being used to train the model for determining what, again, the likelihood was of those folks to attend. So let's see, I think that's it for questions. So again, thank you all. I think we'll stop here. If you do have any questions come up later, feel free to reach out to us. I mean, you can find all our emails at grayassociates.com, somewhere on our team page. So thanks again, and we hope to see you in the next one.